All right, folks, hello to those who have just joined us. Glad you're with us for this sixth program in our series in which we want to make sense out of the world we live in through our examination of the great ancient prophets and what they had to say. So we're glad that you've joined us today. Tonight, we're looking at the matter of how can we live in a world that is anything but perfect? What is the solution to the mayhem that we see in the world around us? We want to be people of integrity before man and God. Tonight we're talking about that. So how to be true to your own self, to thine own self, be true. The ancient prophets did have some solutions to today's crumbling values, and I want to talk about that. Without a moral compass, our society is being thrown into a state of serious confusion. Society says your own mind is the standard of conduct. There's nobody who can tell you what to do. Our society's motto seems to be, if it feels good, do it, the old song. If it brings you pleasure, it's okay to do that. And we need to ask ourselves, how well are we doing as a result of these thoughts being so paramount in people's minds? I suppose everybody chafes at the laws and rule book sometimes, myself included, road rules being a classic example of this. But I don't think any of us would like to live in a country where the rule of law no longer applies. It's called anarchy, as we shall see. The security of our nation depends upon the degree of support for the rules that govern it. We all know that. And the same is true of the moral values that people hold. Faithfulness in family relationships is a clear example of the importance of a recognition of wise rules of conduct and personal integrity. And we can't do without these, and so we're going to talk about that tonight. So what is causing the deteriorating state of morals and integrity in our world today? Now, Lucifer, otherwise known as the devil or Satan, is flat out opposed to God's laws, and he's convincing humanity to be the same. And I've put on the screen there, the thing that most irritated Lucifer in heaven was the fact that God had rules, and he didn't like it and rebelled against it, and he wants us to feel the same way about that. He's making breaking God's laws as attractive as possible. He tempts people to think that the laws of God are outdated and a restriction on happiness and life, and that we don't need laws to govern our behavior. We know what is right. Well, the results speak for themselves, don't they? And he's been very effective in getting that idea across. So where did it lead Lucifer? Well, he lost heaven because he rebelled against God's laws and was disobedient. It didn't do him any good at all. But he still hates God's law, and he's waging an unceasing battle against them and against those who endeavour to be faithful to them. And I want to talk about that tonight, because it is so important that we get that right. It's interesting. Human rules and laws are actually based on God's laws, and you'll see that as I go through them in a moment. This is particularly true in Western countries, especially countries where the Bible and its teachings have had the greatest impact on the formation of the country. And we'll see how this has played out in history. So, why is Lucifer so all out opposed to God's commandments? Well, first of all, this is point one, Satan can argue that everybody's on his side. Everyone breaks them. Nobody can keep them. Then he says in point two, with so many lawbreakers, you can't punish everybody. Number three, how can God forgive those Christians and condemn the rest of us? He goes on. And then he says in point four, no one can keep God's law. Even his followers can't. God's laws are unreasonable. So that's the point he's making. And we need to realize that if he can get everybody believing that God's laws are unreasonable, then he can take God's place and say, I can do it better than that. So there's a bigger picture here going on than we realize. There's a great controversy in progress between God on the one hand and Lucifer on the other. The security of the entire universe is at stake, not just this world. What we do here and what happens here, however, has an impact on the rest of the universe, which is interesting, isn't it? Now, Lucifer wanted to seriously bother Eve and all of humanity by God's laws. And so he made this really interesting statement. He said, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The implication here is that's a bit unreasonable, isn't it? And he's still doing the same thing today, making people bothered by God's laws. Adam and Eve lost Eden just as Lucifer lost heaven because of disobedience. Today, I can see and believe that God is calling his people back to his 10 Commandment law. So I want to talk about that today. Obedience and loyalty go hand in hand. And it's very important to God, our loyalty. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. If we hold him in high esteem, that's what we will do, because obedience is a sign of loyalty and love, declaring just whose side we are on. The 10 Commandments are the foundation of God's government in the world and in the universe. And we'll see as we go along how important that is. The 10 Commandments, they're simple, they're concise, they're clear, a child can understand it. I remember as a child learning the 10 Commandments at Sunday school, and some of you will have done the same. God has made it very clear to us exactly the way he wants us to live. And this is what will bring us happiness. And today, lawlessness is a global problem. In describing our time, Jesus made this statement that's on the screen. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Lawlessness will abound. An attitude of lawlessness, folks, damages human relationships. Love is overwhelmed by a lawless attitude. More upon that as we go along. And the results do speak for themselves. I showed you this slide a couple of programs ago. Today in Australia, 1 in 6 boys, 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. And that's a great concern. We also looked at this, remember? The main top problems in the school of the year 2000 and the year 2023, I might add. And there's the list: drugs, alcohol, pregnancy, rape, assault, and then gender confusion. I want to spend a few moments on that today. So-called gender fluidity is the greatest threat to our children that has ever been seen. Why do I say that? Well, to begin with, while much effort goes into affirming transgender children, and they certainly need help, at the same time, those children who are gender comfortable and who make up the vast majority are not being affirmed, and that's a concern to me. These children need to know that they are okay being the people that they are. They need their identity as male or female to be affirmed. The hesitancy, which seems to be occurring worldwide at the moment, in calling children boys and girls is contributing to childhood uncertainty about their personal identity. Now, this is a major mistake, and our children are the ones who will pay the price. I'm very concerned about it. This is the real problem. The media. Now, Satan has managed to get the generation that we're living obsessed with sexuality. Hasn't proved too hard for him to do it, I don't think. It was initially a gift from God, sexuality, but it's been distorted in our age into an obsession with the matter itself, without love and commitment. And our kids are being exposed to it on the television and other media. Through television and the internet, excessive violence, sex, total lack of decency and morals have invaded our home. They're right there in our homes, folks. And it's a great concern, isn't it? I know you share this with me. Our children are exposed to various versions of right and wrong, and herein lies the problem. The gender confusion is a direct result of this uncertainty over what constitutes right and what constitutes wrong. These are competing values for the minds of our children. We don't know what even these little kids are watching, folks. It's amazing what they have access to. A high-tech, media-savvy society which offers sex, violence, and greed as its prime time viewing, I can assure you, is in serious trouble. And the Hollywood images penetrate the home. And the messages that they get across to our young people are a great tragedy. Your children and grandchildren have access today to the most depraved actions of which humans are capable, and it's right there in our homes. The average 18-year-old has witnessed 200,000 violent acts on television and 40,000 murders. And you might be wondering this, does the form of entertainment we watch make any difference in our thinking processes? Does it really produce some of the violent behaviours we've witnessed in recent years? Folks, it's a law of the mind that by beholding, we become changed. The things we feed our mind and our senses with are the things that are moulding us into the people that we are. Our home has been a traditional place of family togetherness, love and tenderness. That's where children should be learning how to live life and how to conduct a family, a happy family. And so how do we protect our homes and our children from the influences we've just been talking about that will damage them? Well, we need to deal with that, and here we go. Now, this is a basic principle from the book of Proverbs, the great prophet. And this man was the wisest man who ever lived. His name was Solomon. And he said, "He who trusts in his own heart is a fool." Strong words. The prevailing view is that we can all make up our own minds about what is right and wrong. It's trusting your own heart. Believe it or not, I heard one quite intelligent sounding man arguing about how wrong it is for the courts to punish someone for a criminal act. Who are we, he said, to judge this person as having done something wrong? Now, where do you stop with that line of thinking? It's a description of anarchy, actually. The rule of law is what makes this country a safe place. Without the rule of the law in the land, you have anarchy. And you turn away from good and just law, and that's what you do, achieve, folks. Hosea, the prophet Hosea wrote, "They sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind." This is where an attitude of lawlessness ends up. It leads us to that. The criminal mind takes the view that laws are there to break, and unfortunately, a lot of people are taking the same position. Sow the wind, you'll reap the whirlwind. Now, without a moral compass, our society is thrown into a state of confusion, and I put it to you, folks, that's where it is at the moment. When our society says your own mind is the standard for conduct, when your society says there's nobody who can tell you what to do, when our society's motto is, if it feels good, do it, if it brings you pleasure, do it, then, folks, we are on the edge of serious trouble. The society that we live in is a society that largely says you're not responsible for your action, because that's where this leads. And so you can conduct yourself improperly, even carry out a criminal act, and it's somebody else's fault. The idea that I'm only responsible to myself, I'm not responsible to a higher power like God, is awfully misleading. So how do you protect moral values for yourself, for your family, in an immoral world? How do you do that? How can we protect the minds of our children and grandchildren? How can you be moral in an immoral world? Okay, I want to talk about that. Now, this man, British uni historian Sir Arnold Toynbee, examined 21 past civilizations. This man's an historian. And he came up with this question: why did past civilizations disintegrate and collapse? And he answered the question. He discovered it was through abandon, which is anarchy really, or lawlessness. That was the downfall of these nations. And I thought, that is fascinating. Now, the prophet John has some insights that can turn around society's crumbling values. And these are the insights. I'm reading here from Revelation chapter 14 and verse 6 and 7 here, for those who are interested. I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven. Now this, by the way, this angel typifies a people who give a message. God always uses human beings, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth. Now that's the first point. There's hope for us and the world in the everlasting gospel. We'll talk about that in a moment. He goes on to say, he just continues on, he said with a loud voice, "Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come." You've got that right, folks. God has a judgment and it's coming. Now, who actually makes that particular announcement? A few verses further on down in chapter 14, it tells us about the patience of the saints. That's the people of God. By the way, a biblical saint is anybody who believes in Jesus and follows him. The word saint means holy one, literally. And so that's how God considers you if you believe in Jesus tonight. You don't have to know everything, folks, just as long as you're off first base. That's all God asks. He goes on to say, this is what they say, or what they are noted for. They keep the commandments of God, that's good, and the faith of Jesus. The two go hand in hand. One without the other will not do, both. And behold, a white cloud, on the cloud one sat, like the Son of Man. So right after this announcement, and by these people who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, you've got the announcement that Jesus has come. Now, in the Old Testament times, the prophet spoke very clearly about the commandments of God. And because I'm dealing with how old are these commandments? Well, we're looking at that now. Fear, which means love and awe, the Lord your God, as long as you live by keeping all his decrees and commandments. We've talked a lot about loyalty being demonstrated by obedience, and it's so true. And it's quite throughout all the prophets. This is an interesting statement by the prophet Moses. He declared to you his covenant. A covenant's a contract, which he commanded you to perform, the 10 Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. This is interesting. Not on a parchment, folks, stone tablets. A bit hard to rub them out. And he gave these 2 stone tablets to Moses, and Moses brought them back into the camp of Israel where they were at the time, down at Mount Sinai, and he put them in the Ark of the Covenant. Some of you may know that. This is a picture of the Ark of the Covenant there in the background. See it? That was in the most holy place of the sanctuary or the temple. So according to the prophet John, God is calling the world's attention back to the 10 Commandments. That's what he's doing. Our world desperately needs some certainty. Now, when I was a boy growing up in the Church of England, we saw the 10 Commandments in the prayer book every time we took the communion service. And that's a photograph I took of the prayer book, of the communion. And if you look there, you'll see the statement, the 10 Commandments. And that's where they were. And interestingly, I've got a very dear cousin in the Catholic Church, and she assures me that they also hold the 10 Commandments as still authoritative today. And I'm very keen to share that important information with you. Folks, if our culture would take the 10 Commandments seriously, we would not be in the corner that we're in now. You think about what a difference it would make to the whole world. I want to talk about the purpose of the 10 Commandments. What do the prophets say about that? Well, firstly, we've already noticed this. The 10 Commandments are the standard of judgment. God will judge the world at the end of time. Make no mistake about that. Whether people are ready for it, want it or not, it's going to happen. God is a God of love, remember that. And he's got a way of dealing with it. So I want you to be encouraged by the fact that we're going to have some good news here tonight. The 10 Commandments have a leading role in assessing who qualifies to live in paradise for eternity. That's what the judgment is about, to see who goes there. If there wasn't a line in the sand over obedience to the commandments of God, if the commandments of God were not made clearly as part of that, then if God took us all to the paradise without even bothering about them, then the world in paradise would end up looking just like it is now. You can be sure of that. Judgment implies responsibility. We are responsible for what we do. And I think I'm dealing with and talking to people who believe that tonight. We're responsible for our choices. And the world today needs to know and accept responsibility for its actions. And God has a standard of morality for us. This is interesting. This is the prophet James, and he says this: "So speak and so do of those who will be judged by the law of liberty." Now, this goes right against what Lucifer says about the commandments of God, doesn't it? It's very interesting. The 10 Commandments are not a restriction on human liberty, but they are a statement of where true freedom can be found. Look, I've met so many people in my life, and you have too. The heart of people is never at rest when people are deliberately breaking God's laws. There is no peace for those with an attitude of lawlessness. It just is not possible. It sets us free, folks. It sets us free. James goes on to say, "Whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point is guilty of them all. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not murder.'" James is highlighting an attitude of lawlessness here. Think about this. If a person is willing to break one commandment, then they've broken the spirit of the whole law, haven't they? If they do it deliberately. And so that, to me, is very clear. The second purpose of the 10 Commandments is the 10 Commandments define and protect our most important relationships. This is vital. We're going to look now at the benefits that God intended humanity to derive from keeping his law. So it protects our most important relationships. The first 4 of the 10 protect our relationship with God. It's interesting, the heart of human beings is restless, folks, with an indefinable longing which can only be fulfilled by connecting ourselves with God. We were made to be united with God through his Spirit. That was the way God made us in the beginning. So no wonder we're restless until we find our peace with him. It's a need we all share. There's nobody different here. People try to fill that void with all kinds of things, alcohol, drugs, the good life, but they don't bring peace. Only God himself will fulfill the longings of the human heart. And the commandments were designed to protect our relationship with him so that we have that oneness and closeness to God. Here's the first one. "You shall have no other gods before me." Now, I know that someone was probably joking when they said this, but look at it. It kind of epitomizes what really goes on. For sale, golf clubs, sofa, TV, other household gods. Well, folks, we endeavor to replace God with a lot of things. Cars. Now, nothing wrong with having a nice car. We've all got cars. You can't get around without them. But some people make a god out of these things, don't they? Some people make a god out of sport. But God is clear. Nothing is to take his place. Well, we're unhappy with it. The second commandment, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image, a likeness of anything that is in heaven above or in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." That's interesting. So God says, just don't do it. Now, if we portray the Creator by something he created, that's a major contradiction. He says, don't do that. Do not bring me down to the level of the things that I have made, wood, stone, even gold and silver and precious gems. Don't do it, he's saying. He went on to say, "You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." I know people sometimes say, and often say, in fact, well, these just help to represent God to us. Folks, just remember, he said, don't do it. He knows best. This is an interesting experience. Some years ago, myself and my family were in the Solomon Islands and we were ministering there. And what you can see on the screen is some devil charms, and it's probably our son Michael holding them. And the man who owned those devil charms, they were his idols, by the way, he decided to follow Jesus and he gave them away. So he gave them to us and we burnt them. These charms, these idols, folks, with one of them, he killed people. And with the other, the devil took food to his family up in the mountains every week because he was in prison for murder, not from using these things. He'd murdered someone with his own bare hands. He was in jail for that. He was giving that power away and he was so happy to do so. It's such an interesting thing that, by the way, they just rolled up pieces of bark. That's all they are. And idols, well, this one speaks for itself. Would you make an idol out of that? That man, that historian Toynbee that I quoted a few moments ago, he also made this statement in his study of history. He said, the sin of idolatry through a worship of the creature instead of the creator, we have found one of the causes of those breakdowns from which the disintegration of civilizations follow. In other words, it brings God down to a level below the human being. And, we're not ever going to rise above our own view and picture of God. So it makes a big difference. I want you to listen carefully to something now. What each individual does has its contribution to the society that we live in as a whole. No man liveth unto himself. Everything that you do, that I do, is influencing other people on a daily basis. How important it is that we get it right. And that's why worshipping idols can bring others down, because it affects us, and in turn we affect others. So God knew what he was talking about. This is the third commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. This has become an art form in our age, hasn't it? And people blaspheme God's name all the time, and it makes me cringe. The mighty creator. Then the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You notice I've highlighted the word remember because most of the world has forgotten. The Sabbath day, he says, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And that's the day that he set aside for him to be with us. This is quality time, not only for being with God, but for being with our family. People work 7 days a week often, but God is saying, don't do that. Take the time for the things that really count in life. Time for me, he's saying, and time for your family. Your family needs you. So the first four protect our relationship with God and, by extension, our relationship with our family as well. And these are the source of real inner happiness. Breaking the 10 Commandments breaks our relationship with God. And I think this is the greatest concern that I have about it. It separates us from God, just as it did with Adam and Eve. And the prophet Isaiah wrote, but your iniquities, it says there on the screen, have separated you from your God. People are lonely today, and this is why. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. If you hold him in high esteem, it's a given, folks. It's not rocket science. It's a relationship thing. Okay, there are 6 more commandments. The last 6 commandments protect our relationship with other people, our family, and others around us. Here's the first of those 6. Honor your father and your mother. If that happens, what a happy family we have. You shall not kill. I want you to notice what is stated in the commandment is the worst of a particular type of sin. Jesus actually pointed out himself that to hate someone is to break this commandment, to kill. And that's rather interesting, isn't it? You shall not commit adultery. We make a vow until death us do part, but this often interrupts that. Jesus said that adultery is also the worst of a type of sin that begins with lusting in the mind. Sin starts in the heart and mind, but it doesn't stop there. People act out what they think about. So it's protecting our health as well as our families, and nothing more needs to be said. Then the commandment, you shall not steal, that makes good sense. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie. Don't you just love people who always tell the truth? I love people of integrity like that. Moving on, commandment number 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. Envy and jealousy is the source of a huge amount of conflict. Folks, it's the purpose that drives people to create wars between nations. Pure greed and jealousy and envy. Some of you will remember Billy Graham, a good Baptist, probably the most influential preacher of the baby boomers age. And he said, the 10 Commandments are never out of date, and they're not. Okay, so what have we decided and discovered about God's law and its function. First of all, we've discovered the 10 Commandments are the standard of judgment. Secondly, the 10 Commandments protect our relationships. Thirdly, the 10 Commandments reveal or point out sin or wrongdoing. This is the problem with our society that I mentioned before. How can people know what is right and wrong if they don't know what the 10 Commandments say and don't believe that they have authority? This is what the prophet wrote in Romans. He said, by the deeds of the law, no flesh shall be justified. In other words, you're not to be made right with God by doing this, but the law gives you the knowledge of sin. You know what is wrong. That's what sin is. And of course, you will know what is right. How else can we know? It removes the uncertainty from everyday life if we know this. God's law defines sin. This is an interesting statement. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Lawlessness is the condition of the heart and mind. It's an attitude. An attitude is everything. In this case, it's an attitude to resist the restrictions of God's law as they understand it. Our whole society pays the price when people are lawless in their mind. The society we live in is a society that largely says you're not responsible for your actions. Anybody but you is responsible. Your upbringing, you had a bad start in life, you didn't have the advantages of others. Folks, people need to know there is such a thing as right and wrong. I'm so glad there is, aren't you? It's a great relief to me. If our culture would accept this, then God will be able to continue to prosper and bless our nation. I'm serious, it will make a big difference. Okay, point number 4, when we're talking about the functions of God's law. This one's interesting. Obedience to the 10 Commandments shows whose side we are on in the great controversy between God and Satan. It's a matter of loyalty. He's looking for people who will stand up and be counted on his side, because it is making very clear that the way God manages the universe, if I can put it like that, is the best possible way. You might be convinced of it already. Others need you to encourage them. Israel had some very interesting experiences, and I'm going to walk from the top here. Like Adam and Eve, Israel was warned about the results of disobeying God. This is the prophet Moses. Observe carefully all his commandments, and all these blessings shall come upon you. If you do not obey, all these curses will come upon you. You shall serve your enemies. So in a sense, though, the Israelite people were in the promised land on a conditional basis, on being obedient and loyal. Well, that sounds fair to me. Look here, disobedience was disloyalty and put them outside the circle of God's protection. And that, unfortunately, is what happened. Israel did turn away from the 10 Commandments. They're a bit like our culture today. You know, our culture was born and bred, if you like, on the Bible and on the 10 Commandments. And our culture is turning away. And I'm very fearful for our country as a result. Moving on to what happened to Israel. The Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom. Israel was split into 2 groups, the northern and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. 136 years later, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, you've heard of him now, they destroyed Jerusalem and the southern kingdom in 586 BC. Daniel the prophet was alive at that time, and he prayed. He was taken captive to Babylon. And as we know, he had quite an influence on Nebuchadnezzar. He prayed. This is what he prayed. We have sinned, he prayed. All Israel has transgressed your law and has departed so as not to obey your voice. Therefore, the screen goes on, the Lord has kept the disaster in mind and brought it upon us. He's basically saying we've brought it upon ourselves by transgressing his laws, tragically. And the world today faces a similar challenge to Israel. That's what I'm concerned about. This is the Apostle Mark. He made a prophetic statement here. He said, in vain they worship me. He's quoting God here, teaching as doctrines, that's beliefs, the commandments of men. Commandments men have made up. For laying aside the command of God, you hold the tradition of men. He said, you've replaced my commandments with your own ideas. Now, men's ideas, as we've discovered already tonight, are not reliable. And God is saying the traditions of men are a waste of time. God wants our hearts and he wants our loyalty, not empty actions, no matter how impressive they might be. This is our historian Toynbee again. He noted, remember, lawlessness leads to destruction. He was talking about the destruction of a nation. Great nations have destroyed themselves by an attitude of lawlessness. Now, the Ten Commandments law speaks with relevance to our society today. It gives direction, gives certainty to our lives, and this is so important. I want to share something with you now that may surprise you. This is the wise man Solomon. Remember, the wisest man who ever lived. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Most do not realize that the prosperity of a nation depends upon the moral state of the people and their faithfulness to God's principles. It did for Israel, as we just saw, and it's the same with the nations today. God blesses a people, a nation, a culture that is faithful and obedient to his moral law, if you like, the Ten Commandments. And it's amazing. Now, this is an interesting statement. Joseph Dobrian, who you can see there, this man is not a believer. He's an atheist. He said that up there. But look at what he says. He's an American. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a personal God, but I see the benefits of Judeo-Christian values. They are indispensable to our society. This man, being a historian, he understands the foundations of the society, where they came from. It just so happens, he wrote, that common decency in general lines up with Judeo-Christian teachings. Honour your parents. Don't bear false witness. Don't steal, don't covet. What's he quoting from there? The Ten Commandments. He goes on to say this: American history can't be taught at all without introducing children to Christianity. And I'm going to put it to you that that's the same in Australia. And explaining how it shaped the overall culture of Europe and the Americas. Pardon me for a moment. He's not the only one, by the way, who noted these things. This is a sociologist named Rodney Stark in his book, America's Blessings. This is what he wrote. It's worth reading through. All Americans are safer and their property more secure because this is such a religious nation, he said. The average person in irreligious Sweden is 3.5 times more likely as the average American to be criminally assaulted and 2 times as likely to be the victims of theft. And if you were surprised about that, folks, so was I. I really was. It's amazing. He again recognizes the benefits of a Bible-based culture and an understanding of the Ten Commandments. This is the Apostle John. This is the love of God, he says, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. Why, folks, they're not. James calls it the law of liberty, remember? A law that sets you free. To know what is right and to do what is right is to be truly free. Folks, there's no peace like it. You know, I had a very interesting experience not so long ago. And this young woman who'd recently been through a divorce said to me, she said, if I ever marry again, she said, the first thing I'm going to ask the person I'm interested in is, do you pay an honest tax? I thought, well, that's an interesting one. I suppose she figured that if they're honest about that, they'll be honest about everything else as well. And that's good. You know what the good book says about finding the right person to marry? It says this: what is desired in a man, and I suggest a woman as well, what is desired in a man is kindness. That kind of covers it all, doesn't it? The person's kind, there'll be everything else as well. Practice that, young men. Okay, one thing God's law does not do, I want to make this very clear. By the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. That word justified means, it's a play on the words is justified, just as if I'd never sinned, never made a mistake. God counts you justified as though you have never made a mistake because you believe in Jesus. Now, I tell you what, that is just mind-boggling. He goes on to say, by the law is the knowledge of sin. Of course, that's how we know what is right and wrong. But it can't save us. It can't take us to eternity, folks. Only Jesus can do that. So then, what is the solution for 1, breaking God's law, 2, restoring our broken relationship with God, and 3, obeying and following God's law out of love? What's the solution? How do we do that? Well, remember we read this a moment ago. I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven with the everlasting gospel to preach to the whole world, right? So that's the solution. That's the world's greatest need, is to hear that. Here's the gospel in a nutshell. 1, Jesus died for our transgression of his law. And the prophet wrote, he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, took your place, my place. 2, his death restored our relationship with God. The prophet wrote, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son. Reconciled. We are friends again. Father and son, father and daughter again. 3, he now puts his law in our affections. And as the psalmist wrote, oh, how I love your law. Now, this is a very wonderful principle, folks. This comes from the book of Hebrews. This is the covenant, that's the contract, that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. And by the way, this is a promise to every believer as well. You'll see that. I will put my laws in their mind and write them in their hearts. In other words, he will take away from us an attitude of lawlessness and give us an attitude of lawfulness. This is going to create a people of integrity, folks. If this occurred across the board in our country, Australia, we'd be on the way to paradise, believe me. And there's more. He goes on to say, I will be their God, they shall be my people. All of them shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, the heart cry to know God. He promises that. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and lawless deeds I'll remember no more. He puts our sins and throws them into the depths of the sea, a completely clean start. You'll be justified, just as if I'd never sinned. It's a fantastic statement. John the Revelator was given a vision of God's end time people in his vision, and this is what they were like. We looked at this a moment ago. The dragon was enraged with the woman, reference to the people of God, went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Remember I told you the devil is angry with God and with anybody who faithfully follows him and obeys him. And that's why you as a believer have God's protection, dear friends, because you need it. All right. How has Lucifer managed to con the whole world into lawlessness? You've probably heard of the beast or the mark of the beast. The beast is otherwise known as the Antichrist power. Lucifer would use this power as a cover for himself to attack God's law in very subtle ways. He would mess with God's law. And we saw this, or haven't actually seen this back in Daniel as yet. He shall think himself able to change times and laws. Daniel said that's the Antichrist power. He was going to mess with God's law. Then the Revelation says he went to make war with the remnant of her descendants who keep the commandments of God. Now, isn't it interesting? He wants to get rid of them altogether and anybody who goes that direction. Finally, here's that scripture we just read a moment ago. Here is the patience of the saints who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So despite the pressure on them, the remnant, the final faithful people, remain faithful. And they are still keeping the faith and keeping the commandments of God. Now, this is his great offer. It's the greatest offer in all of history, folks. Jesus said, I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds I will write them. Let Jesus write his law in your heart and declare your loyalty to him. And folks, it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to you. Many of you are on the way with this, I know already. And that's fantastic. If you're not sure, just say, Lord, put your law, write it in my heart tonight. This is the statement. Here's the patience of the saints. They keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. They have accepted God's gracious offer of the new heart, the lawful heart, being in harmony with God's law in heart and mind. And that's a wonderful thing. And so these are the ones who are waiting for Jesus to come back the second time. It's a very simple description because that's all it needs to be. That's all we need to know, folks. We can all understand that. I'm going to pray for us all together. Would you like to join me? Father in heaven, thank you for the amazing guide you have given us in dealing with a world that has lost its moral direction and moral compass. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for the offer of putting your law in our hearts so that we love to serve and to honour you and be loyal to you. I pray that you'll touch the heart and everyone who's joining in this prayer tonight with that wonderful miracle in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, people, next week's program, we're going to deal with a very interesting subject here: humanity, a deliberate design or a freak accident. I think you're going to find this very fascinating. So join us again as we look at what the ancient prophets have to say about this amazing subject.